So in class, we were talking about how did developments of Europe impact Latin America. And this right here is going to be a continuation of what we were talking about in class. Because in class, we already talked about how did the Enlightenment influence movements for independence and how also did Mexico gain its independence. And we know that in Mexico, there was an attempt for there to be a movement led by the lower classes and Father Hidalgo and Father Morelos. And in the end, it wound up being a movement of the upper class and the Creoles. And so when we look at South America, we really kind of focus on a man by the name of Simon Bolivar. And Simon Bolivar is considered in some ways like the George Washington of South America. And Bolivar was from Venezuela. And he basically was, he had a lot of different roles. So a quote about Bolivar is that he was a soldier, a diplomat, a general, an administrator, a visionary, a newspaper publisher, a lawgiver, a national president, a dictator, a lover, and a disillusioned revolutionary. So he was, like I said, he was from Venezuela. He was the son of a Venezuelan Creole aristocrat, so he was pretty wealthy growing up. He studied in Europe from the ages of 16 to 19. So when he was 16 until he was 19 years old, he studied in Spain. And so he kind of saw how politics were being run in Europe and some of the changes that were happening in Europe. His wife died very young. So at that point, he decided to devote himself to politics. So he goes back to Europe to study the philosophes. And he comes back to Venezuela in 1807 and begins to join various movements for Venezuelan independence. And in his early efforts, he was kind of a failure. He failed in his attempts to get England in particular to recognize Venezuela as an independent country. So England being one of the most powerful nations in the world, he figured if he was able to gain recognition of Venezuelans' independence and gain support for the revolution in Venezuela, then this would give Venezuela a lot of credibility and be able to stand up against Spain. But he failed in those efforts. In 1811, he was serving as an army officer in Venezuela, and he actually worked to gain Venezuela's independence. But then they lost their independence within a year. And so what we're going to see is that in the beginning struggle for Venezuela in particular to gain their independence, they had like one step forward and then a step back. So they would gain independence and they would lose independence. So after failing to keep Venezuela's independence in 1811, in 1813, he captures the city of Caracas. He reasserts Venezuelan independence, but then he's defeated and exiled again in 1814. And then while he was in exile, in particular living in Jamaica in 1815, he writes a document that's referred to as the Jamaica Letter. And the Jamaica Letter is an important letter. In fact, we're going to read it in class. And in that letter, he is trying to gain, again, British diplomatic recognition of Venezuela's independence. And so he writes in that letter, he wanted to end what he called was economic servitude of Venezuela. So after kind of being in Jamaica for a while, he renews his military expeditions and he actually begins to be successful. He gains support. He does manage to gain support from Britain, and he gains support from Haiti. And the Haitians were willing to give him support in return for agreeing to free South American slaves. So in 1819, he defeats Spain, and the Republic of Colombia is declared, and he becomes president and military dictator of Colombia. Within 2 years, he also manages to liberate Venezuela, his home country, and also the country of Ecuador. Now, in southern South America, there was another pretty prevalent man. His name was Jose de San Martin, and he was focused in Argentina. So Bolivar is seen in a lot of ways. San Martin is seen kind of as the muscle of the revolution. So, like I said, he was from it was then called the colony of the Rio de la Plata, which today is Argentina. And he was one of the greatest military strategists in South America. Now, Buenos Aires, which was the capital of the Rio de la Plata, was a really booming commercial center in the late 18th century. And the resident merchants there really resented Spanish trade restrictions. So in 1816, San Martin helped gain independence for what were called then United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, which would be, again, Argentina, but also Uruguay and Paraguay. So they gained their independence in 1816. His army then crosses the Andes with his general, Bernardo Higgins. They cross the Andes into Chile, and they join up with revolutionaries there. And they also promised freedom to any slaves who joined in the fight with them. And so once San Martin and O'Higgins managed to defeat the Spanish in Chile, San Martin leaves O'Higgins to rule Chile, and then San Martin moves north into Peru, which was still under Spanish control, and he helps to liberate Peru. He then meets with Bolivar in Ecuador in 1822. You can kind of see in this picture here the two men meeting, and they decide to kind of join forces. And by 1825, all of the South American countries are independent. Now, Bolivar had this vision of, and so you can see here just this map kind of showing Bolivar and San Martin kind of fighting for independence. Now, Bolivar, though, had this vision of what he called a Grand Colombia. So what he wanted to see was basically a united South America, basically a United States of South America, similar to what we have in North America. But so he ruled what was called Grand Colombia, which today would basically be Venezuela and Colombia kind of combined. And that was there until 1830. But basically, the political and regional interests eventually lead to the breakup of Grand Colombia. Bolivar was very disillusioned. He was very fearful that that South America would break out into anarchy. He rejected, though, attempts to crown him as king. So the people wanted to make him king. He rejected those attempts. And until his death in 1830, he didn't live very long after all these countries gained their independence. He remained committed to the cause of independence and committed to the cause of a Republican government. And when we do the readings, we're going to read, like I said, the Jamaica letter, which kind of shows his vision for South America. We're also going to read the Venezuelan Constitution in class, in which he's going to kind of talk about some of the challenges he feels that Venezuela is going to face and the type of government system he thinks that would work the best for Venezuela and South America. But so basically, by this point, by 1830, we have, Mexico is independent. And when Mexico first gained its independence, it also included many of the countries of Central America. And then we see that South America gains its independence, at least the Spanish colonies of South America gains their independence, which just leaves us finally with Brazil. So the last thing we're going to talk about is how did Brazil gain their independence. So Brazil, which was, of course, was a Portuguese colony, at the end of the 18th century was seeing a large growth in its population and its economy. And Brazil has a very, very, very large enslaved population, similar to Haiti, and they really were fearful of a Haitian-like revolution. And in fact, that fear led them to crack down on their enslaved people. And that's why Brazil is one of the last places to free their slaves. And their people are not freed from slavery until the late 1800s, like 1880s, is ultimately when enslaved people gained their independence in Brazil. But in 1807, French troops back in Europe invaded Portugal. And the Portuguese royal family was forced to flee Portugal, and they come to Brazil. So that means that during the Napoleonic Wars and the Napoleonic period in Europe, Rio de Janeiro becomes the capital of a Portuguese empire because the king and queen are residing in Brazil. So as a result, Brazil has equal status with Portugal. Its ports are open to world commerce, and there's a lot of development and money kind of pouring into Rio de Janeiro. But it also helps to kind of reinforce that colonial relationship between Brazil and Portugal because, again, you have the Portuguese royal family residing in Brazil. So until 1820, Dom Pedro João, I'm probably mispronouncing that, the sixth, was residing in Brazil. And like I said, there was a lot of improvements that were made to Rio during that time period. Schools were built, commerce was really doing really well. A lot of Portuguese also emigrated to Brazil, like the bureaucrats and the nobles all came with the king and queen. In 1820, though, Napoleon is defeated, and basically the Portuguese king goes back to Portugal. But what he does is he leaves his son Pedro to rule Brazil as his regent. And he basically tells his son, look, if the people begin to demand independence from Portugal, you should be the one to lead the movement. So he was like, basically the king of Portugal was okay with Brazil separating and becoming its own separate country, as long as that own separate country was under the control of his son, which really necessarily wouldn't be that separate. So in September of 1822, Brazil declares their independence, and Pedro I becomes the first king of Portugal, and basically it becomes a constitutional government, constitutional empire, basically. But ultimately, Brazil is eventually going to overthrow their monarchy and become a republic later in the 1800s. So at that point, I just want you to think about this question. How do the Latin American independence movements compare with the North American? And do you think these movements were really a product of the Enlightenment? And I was told I had to give Torsten a shout out, so I'm giving Torsten a shout out. And I hope you guys all have a great day.